into this. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something genuinely fascinating. It's a deeply personal, incredibly raw autobiographical account from someone who spent 22 years inside the highly structured religious organization Opus Dei. And you know, what makes this text so gripping isn't just the timeline. It's this vivid, systematic breakdown of an internal psychological rupture. The author gives us a meticulously detailed list of exactly what they experienced on the inside. Which brings us to this striking number, 21. According to their own account, out of their 22 total years within the organization, they spent 21 of them crying. I mean, just think about that for a second. That is an astonishing, almost unimaginable ratio of time spent in distress. Now, our goal here isn't to judge or take sides on the institution itself, but really to objectively examine the anatomy of this distress. How exactly does someone spend over 2 decades in an environment that causes them this level of daily, persistent emotional pain? So the fundamental question we have to ask today is simply, why did they cry? Well, the author actually outlined 26 distinct reasons for this profound internal descent. To really grasp the gravity of this experience, we've analyzed the text and categorized these 26 points into clear thematic buckets. We'll look at the psychological suppression, the systemic mechanisms of control, the extreme isolation, and the physical toll, just to understand exactly how this 22-year rupture occurred. Section 1, the loss of self, disconnection, and duplicity. This is where the psychological unraveling really begins. The author describes being forced to completely ignore, repress, and literally punish their own natural feelings and longings. They're incredibly blunt about it, stating, "I cried as a cry for help from my being, because I was disconnected from my inner self, from my sensitivity, from my tastes and inclinations." The source material actually notes an obsessive demand in their spiritual direction to, and this is a direct quote, "guard my heart with 7 locks." By locking away those 1,001 normal manifestations of human emotion, the author experienced a complete disconnection from what it means to just be human. They noted it took months after leaving just to be able to answer a simple question like, "What do you feel?" And this brilliantly illustrates the next layer of their psychological burden, which is this intense duplicity. So imagine this scenario. At just 19 years old, the author was given the immense responsibility of providing spiritual direction to guide and orient others. They had to pretend to be this faithful model of God's will, all while secretly drowning internally. In fact, their own internal crisis is kind of what supposedly qualified them to help others. They talk about receiving the private confidences of capable, vibrant women who are also crumbling and fading away under the institutional demands. The dissonance of acting as a spiritual anchor while personally desiring to just escape, or actually even die, as the author painfully admits, it created this massive internal fracture. Section 2, Mechanisms of Control, the Infinite Labyrinth. To really understand these rules, we first need to define a term the author uses repeatedly, which is numerary. Within this specific institutional vocabulary, a numerary is a celibate member who essentially hands over their full time, their entire income, and basically their whole life to the organization. This was the author's designated vocation, and it carried incredibly heavy, what they call castrating demands. You see, the internal distress didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was sustained by a very specific, systemic set of rules actively designed to retain members. Now, what's really interesting about this is the jarring daily contradiction the author experienced. On one hand, the institution constantly repeated the chorus that members were common and ordinary laypeople. But the reality of their daily life involved handing over their entire salary, navigating forced periods of afternoon and evening silence, and giving up all privacy. It went so far that they couldn't even read their own personal mail unless a director had read it first. It's this massive gap between the rhetoric of ordinary life and the extreme daily reality of total surrender that really drove the author's frustration. The author specifically lists the mechanisms that generated what they call unconscious schizophrenia and violence to conscience. For instance, they were required to prepare what they viewed as immoral personal reports on the people they directed, taking those private struggles into meeting rooms to be exposed in front of directors and priests. Plus, they were taught to instrumentalize their natural friendships purely for proselytism, basically courting friends just to recruit them. And perhaps most controlling of all, the arguments used to retain people equated leaving the institution with turning your back on God and actively risking your own salvation. Section 3. Isolation and estrangement. The familialism diagnosis. 2, according to the author, 2 hours was the absolute maximum amount of time per week that they were permitted by their director to accompany their own mother after her chemotherapy treatments. I mean, let that sink in for a second. 2 hours a week for a parent battling a severe illness? The source text provides these incredibly poignant recollections of how normal social structures and, crucially, connections to their blood family were systematically severed. And when the author rightfully complained about this incredibly harsh restriction, the trauma was actually compounded. They write that they were threatened with being sent to a psychiatrist and were officially diagnosed by their director as having a familialism problem. This label literally haunted them for years. The organization taught that the work was their new family, which led to such an unnatural disconnect that upon finally leaving the organization, the author realized they barely even knew their own siblings. Let's move to and see how this builds across a timeline. Year-round, they were kept separated from their blood family. Even on days of major celebration, like when 7 of their siblings got married, the author was only allowed to attend the mass. Afterwards, they'd have to return to the center, often in a totally different city, to dine entirely alone. And this isolation even extended to their professional worth. After 3 years of rigorous academic study in Rome, their request to formally validate those studies was rejected. That left them with an unacknowledged gap in their professional life, further separating them from the ordinary world they supposedly belonged to. Section 4. The physical and mental toll. Enduring the unendurable. A major part of this physical toll involves tools of corporal mortification. Just for clarity here, a cilice is a spiked chain worn around the thigh, and disciplines are small whips used on the back, both designed to inflict physical discomfort as a form of spiritual penance. The author recalls the exact day they were handed a discreet little bag containing these items. From that day on, they were expected to use the cilice 6 days a week and the disciplines twice a week. But the mortification went far beyond just those specific instruments. The author describes an endless volume of harsh daily rules incorporated into their life, what the founder allegedly called an inclined plane of increasing demands. We're talking about sleeping on a board bed, sometimes with just a book for a pillow, forcing themselves to take cold water baths, enduring the intimidation, which is a public accusation of a fault, and being required to dress in ill-fitting, out-of-fashion clothes donated by others, which entirely stripped away their personal identity. So the crucial point is, what does an environment like this actually do to the human mind over time? The author anchors this emotion with a shocking piece of data from their own observation. Upon returning from Rome, they discovered that more than 50% of the numeraries they had met in their annual courses were actively taking psychiatric medication. That visualizes a profound systemic mental health crisis running completely parallel to the rigorous spiritual demands. Section 5. The final realization. The 26th reason. In their document, after detailing 25 devastating points of tears, after 21 years of crying through endless rules, lost family time, and just an immense psychological toll, the author reaches their 26th point, the ultimate conclusion. In the final reason reads, I cried mainly because I orthodoxly complied with the infinite labyrinth of prescriptions that is demanded, and I found Jesus nowhere. It's an absolutely devastating realization. The idea that all the perfectionism, the rigid obedience, and the sheer sacrifice ultimately felt completely devoid of the very spiritual core it promised. This explainer takes us through one person's profound journey, but it leaves us all with something massive to ponder. When devotion demands the absolute surrender of the self, the mind, and the body, at what point does the search for the divine become indistinguishable from total institutional control? Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.